Hi, Algebra 2 students. Welcome to your last week of instruction before spring break. Just a reminder before I jump into today's notes, you still have the outstanding stats project that you should hopefully be working on. I've received a ton of emails from you guys asking questions about it or submitting your discussion post documentation. So please make sure you are actively working on that stats project. Other than that, I'm going to get started with our notes for today. This is our last section of notes before spring break, so hopefully you're excited about that. Today we are talking about something called the margin of error. So when we are learning about statistics and when we conduct studies, there's always this thing called margin of error. The margin of error helps determine how accurate a study is. So if your margin of error is large, then your study might not have been super accurate. If your margin of error is small, then that means your study was probably accurate. So when you are sampling your classmates for your stats project, one thing to keep in mind is you want the smallest margin of error as possible. So you want to make sure that the sample that you've chosen is a good representation of the population that you're trying to study. So when we talk about margin of error, we're going to use this formula. The formula we're using for margin of error is plus or minus 1 over the square root of n times 100. Now, n is our sample size. So for your stats project, your sample size is 20, at least 20. Some of you might have more than 20. Some things to keep into consideration when we are talking about sample size. As n increases, your margin of error decreases. That is because as your sample size gets larger and larger, that would mean that you're now surveying a larger percentage of the population. So your margin of error, the difference between the statistic that you calculated for your sample and the parameter of the actual population, that difference between those two quantities is actually smaller. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, when you are actually conducting a study, as n increases, the cost and the time involved in completing the study also increases. So some of you might be familiar with the concept of a census. Every 10 years, the United States conducts a census to see who is living in what areas of the country. This is a huge sample, right? The sample is just the entire population. So they are trying to measure the entire population by doing a census. The definition of a census means that they're asking every single person in the population to answer that question. Now, this only happens once every 10 years in the United States because one major thing, the amount of time that is spent organizing and distributing and conducting the statistical data, and then the cost of all of this. So most of the time you are conducting smaller studies, but as your sample size increases, so does the, or your margin of error actually decreases.